Alright, hello everyone. This is Lego in the flesh. I have a quick video here on how to do some of the both common and complicated techniques that we, or at least I, use whenever we make Gallifreyan artwork in Inkscape. So if you're a new user who wants to try out your hand at Gallifreyan in Inkscape, these tips and tricks should be very good additions, especially if you have any problems with stuff like double letters and why my stroke is acting weird, why my corners are acting weird, stuff like that. I'll just I'll go through most of the tips here in very short order, so I have to assume that you know how Inkscape works and what the tools are and the menus are, because I'm not gonna go over that. Okay? First off, real quick, core behaviors. Most of the time you want your aspect ratio locked, so when you have a circular object and you want to rescale it, it'll always keep proportionality. We like that. Okay? Now in that same vein, you'll notice that the width of the stroke is set to 1 and it remains at 1 no matter how much I scale it. That's because this option is turned off, and I want that because then we control the width of our stroke always. We're always in control. Okay? So locked aspect ratio, no width resizing. Yeah? When it comes to cutting shapes out of your letters, let's just make 3 difference effects right there. You'll notice that the edges stay sharp and clean. No tapered off edges, no blunt edges. It's sharp and crisp. Okay? If you see something different, like say this, where you have these stumps instead of the crisp edges, that's because of your meter threshold. It's the one I just manipulated right there. When you have the joints of your object, you can choose a threshold for when that becomes a sharp point versus a blunt object. So I prefer to have the sharp, crisp edges always. If your circular edges don't have sharp edges and you want them, if they look like this, well, this is the culprit. Okay? Change this to a higher number until it turns into a sharp corner. The same goes for when you have lines. Okay? You look at the lines, the different segments, whenever there's a joint, if it's set to sharp joint, you can have a meter. You can also place it as a cut corner always, or you can have it at rounded corners. But if you have it at sharp, but you don't actually get a sharp, that's because the meter limit is too low. Okay? Change that. It's gonna help you. Let's get rid of that. Stroke order, very shortly. Stroke order is whenever you have both a stroke and a fill color. You don't use fill color in Gallifreyan, at least I don't, and there's a good reason for that, and I'll come back to it. But if you for some reason have both fill and stroke, and the stroke looks different than how it's supposed to be, then the order of the fill and stroke is the culprit. Okay? Right now I have a fill color and a stroke. The stroke is set at 1. If I change the order of appearances to this, you'll see that the width is halved. That's because now the stroke itself is placed behind the fill and they overlap. Now by default, Inkscape shows the entire width of the stroke by placing the stroke at the top, so it's actually overlapping the fill. So if you have weird problems where the fill doesn't appear to be the width it should be, or rather the stroke doesn't appear to have the width it should be, the order of appearances over here is likely the culprit. So play around with that until you see what the order actually is and what it's supposed to be. But I don't usually use fills because it's only the stroke that matters. So I'm going to remove it again. That's just a quick PSA if you work with both at the same time and the stroke doesn't appear as expected. Right. In that same vein, whenever you use circular objects, strokes, to cut into other pieces, you have to remember that strokes, mathematically speaking, don't have any width. It's just for appearance. The actual width of the stroke is 0. It's just a center line. And you can see this center line if you have an object selected and then you go to your nodes tool. If I hover over the circle, notice there's a small blue thin line. That's the actual width. That's the line that matters. Whenever you cut something, no matter how big or small it is, width-wise, it's always going to be the center line that cuts. So here I have 3 shapes. If I use the difference operation, nothing appears to happen, which is fair. But if I do the same with the other shapes, you'll see you would expect as a new user that the cut would appear along the outer edge or maybe the inner edge, but no, it happens right in the middle. So regardless of the width, I still get a cut in the center. Okay, that's very important to grasp if you don't know how the Inkscape operations use paths. They always use the center line if it's a stroke. Okay. Stamping. Stamping is just taking an object or multiple objects and you drag it around while pressing spacebar. That just gives you a quick duplicate of that object, and it can be useful for placing words. If I have a word I need to space out, if I need to make a plan about how I'm gonna put the different words, letters, I can just make one default shape and then I can just stamp it around, see how much space it takes up, and then plan from there. Okay, just spacebar and drag. Now constant widths, I covered that. Always have constant widths. It's gonna help you so much, because otherwise if you scale anything for any reason, now you have different widths going on in your artwork. Now this can be what you want, but it's generally easier if you control whatever width is going on at all times. So I'm going to turn this off and set the width to whatever I want, and it'll stay that way. I'm not going to go over the cut path and difference path because you should know what those are. The difference is, of course, that if you want to cut a path, you only take away the segment you want, whereas if you have used the difference option, you will have the outline remaining on the shape. It's still a complete shape. There's no gap. We use those a lot. Union, etc. We use those if we want to combine different objects into one, and I'll get back to that because it's important when you talk about fill. Snapping is up here. You can either have simple snapping, enabling it, or you can have the advanced snapping where you choose whatever you want to snap to. This is probably most useful when you're actually trying to center up an object to another object, or you want to place lines on the direct center line of a stroke. It's useful for that, not much else. We tend to be more organic in our Gallifreyan writings, and so the snapping tool is actually not that very useful for that. Centering and aligning tools, you'll want to use the Align and Distribute menu. If you have, say, 2 different circles, you want to line them up in the center. You could also use, of course, the snapping to do that by finding the center point of the bounding box. But, if I want to have those perfectly vertical, but also want to put this in the center like that, use those in combination. So, arcs and nodes, very useful. If I have a shape and I know it's a shape and I know it's a circle shape because whenever I have something selected in the info menu at the bottom, there's a little short text here. It shows me what I've selected and what type it is. I have a circle, and that's the only thing I have. If I make an ellipse that's not perfectly circular, it'll tell me it's an ellipse. Okay? So it's also a quick check to see if you actually have proportions turned on and if they actually are the same width and height. If I can't tell, because maybe it's just slightly, maybe it's almost perfectly circular, but it's not, it'll still tell me it's an ellipse. Okay? And I have other object types as well. If I have some lines, it'll tell me that I have, if I go to my selection tool, it'll tell me that I have a path consisting of 3 nodes. So depending on what I have selected, it'll tell me how many objects and what type they are. Okay, this is very important because if I take this circle and it recognizes it as a circle, then I have certain nodes available. We have the scaling, height and width, but we also have the arc. And this is very useful. You can tell that I have 2 nodes, and if I rotate these around with the mouse inside the object, there'll be no connecting line between them. It'll just be this empty arc. If I move my mouse outside while I turn this around, it'll give me the pizza slice option, like the Pac-Man. It'll connect them in the center. If I go to my circle tool, you can tell the different modes that I have available. I can turn it back into a complete circle. I can turn no connecting line on, or I can make a chord, just a straight line connecting it. Okay, the empty fill, empty no line connecting, that's the one we want. That's the one we use the most. It's very powerful. It's very useful when creating double letters, or you want to make circular segments instead of straight lines. Okay, very useful. We'll get back to it. Transform and rotate very quickly. Whenever you have an object and you want to rotate it, it's usually around the center. Okay, if you hold control, it'll rotate by 15-degree increments. If you don't want that, if you want another increment, go to the object menu and then go to transform, and under the rotate you can rotate at any angle you desire. Okay, in those increments, let's say 8 degrees, enter, 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 it'll go 8 degrees. Okay, and I can change, of course, the rotation center if I want to change that. Changing the rotation center back to the beginning, just hold control and click on it. No, shift and click, sorry. And it'll go back to where it was. So that's just very quickly, if you have a specific angle in mind, you want to rotate it by that angle, use transformation. Bam. What have we got left? Info line. The info line at the bottom, very useful, especially when we talk about fills. I'll get back to that. The last thing I want to talk about is autosave. Enable autosave, go to preferences. It happens. It can happen, especially if you're using a lot of nodes at once. Go to your preferences, autosave. You can enable it. I don't think it's enabled by default. It should be. Enable it. Choose where backups should be saved. There is a default location if you don't want to change it. How many minutes between each autosave and how many backups should be stored at once. Like once it reaches 20 backups, it'll delete the oldest one, and like it'll only keep 20 backups. Very useful. Very useful. Okay. Please enable this. You can do a lot in 5 minutes. You can lose a lot in 5 minutes. Now, on to some of the effects. We're not writing Gallifreyan just yet, but I want to talk about some of the effects that we use. And if I take this, turn it back into a complete circle, and just write a simple word here. Let's go with the word tutorial, just because I'm a bit vain. Go back to my path, make that say 1, and then take another duplicate and go. This is how my workflow generally is. I make the framing of my text, which is these two sentence circles, and then I make the word. In this case, there's a single word, so I'm keeping it concentric. And then I want to write the text. Actually, I can show you what I'm doing if I do this. Now you can tell a little bit about what's going on. I'm gonna write tutorial, so it's a T, then another T, and then an R, right? Those are the big letters. Then we have U, we have an O, let's put that here, and then another I, then an A, and then an L. This is a bit quick, but you know, you get the idea. So these are the letters, these are the approximate locations. If I wanted to, I could turn on snapping and I could turn on aligning and I could make these different shapes align. Maybe I want to place these three objects in a perfectly vertical position so it's centered on the vertical axis. Or maybe I could, you know, turn snapping on and place those precisely on the center line of that. I could go on and on, but I don't really tend to do that unless I'm after a certain effect. So turn off snapping. But here I have the raw letters, okay? T-U-T-O-R-I-A-L, okay? Before I go any further and do any destructive editing, I tend to take a backup, duplicate it, and then just move that to the side using the shift movement. Whenever I hold down shift and use the arrow keys, I move in set amounts. This means that if I ever need to go back and use one of these shapes, I can use shift arrow keys to get back the precise location of where they came from. Okay? Turn that to the side. Now it's time for some destructive editing. So I'll use differences for the T, T, and the R, and now we have the letters. Let's go ahead and make some lines appear. We have a U. Maybe I want to just put that straight down. I'll hold control, straight line down there. And then we have the I. This is a pretty big empty space, so maybe I want a circular arc used as the I. So I'll do something like, no, even bigger. Something like this, I think. I'll just take my arc nodes and define the endpoints, making sure that they just don't stick out. Oh, sorry, don't stick out more than I need them to. And we'll have it end right there. Fine, that's cool, that's cool. Let's go with, that's it for lines. Now we just need the 3 dots for the L, right? So here's the tricky part. Strokes have a stroke, but they don't have any fill. If I gave this arc some fill, it would be really ugly. So you don't have any fill in your strokes. Counterpoint, if I make a dot, a complete dot that is, and I want to fill this out, I could just go black and I would have a black fill and a black stroke. But that's a very bad idea. I'll get back to why, but for now just accept this is a very bad idea. You only want one or the other. So I'll go down there and remove the stroke so I just have a fill. That's the way I want it. And I can take this dot tool and place some more dots wherever I want. Maybe there, and there, and there, whatever you desire. And that looks pretty good right there. And now I have my text. Now this empty area over here looks a little bland. Maybe I want a divot there. Ideally, I would make that divot based on this outline, but I don't have it anymore. I used it to make the T. So I go back to my backup, and then I copy this, take that using the increments until it matches up perfectly with the T, and then I'll just shrink it down a bit like that, and I can use that to make my divot. Everything stays perfectly symmetrical, or at least, sorry, concentric. Okay, so this is my text. Now let's look at some of the effects that we can use here. Of course, we can vary the width of the stroke. So maybe I want that 0.5, or maybe I want this one here to be 2. That's basic stuff, yeah. But if I want to make various thicknesses, this line is a prime example. Maybe I want this to have an effect. So I'll go to my path effects, and if you're using 1.2 or earlier, the effects menu is going to look different, but there's the same tools in here. Go find the power stroke. That's one of the most useful tools we have. And nothing appears to happen when we use it because it's a node tool. So I need to go to my nodes, and you'll see that 3 nodes appeared. Okay, these are the ones that control the width at that point. If I drag it out, I'll make it thicker. If I move it up and down, I control where it happens. And it'll just go from one node to the next, right? So the more purple nodes I have, the more control I have. How do I get rid of those? I just hold Alt and press. So hold Alt and then left click on it, and it'll get rid of it. Now I only have one node left, which means there's no scaling happening. So I deleted one too many. How do I get it back? Well, I can create new ones by control clicking on one of these. Control click, and I created one on top, and I can move that away. So ideally I want to make one end down here and one start up here. And now depending on the width, I can make whatever shape I want. And this is a bit tricky because it's just a square, but I can change that in 2 ways. I can either go into this menu and start looking at the butt, make it round, see how that works. Maybe this works out for you, but I mean, it doesn't look very pretty, does it? So what I'm going to do instead is notice the fact that the fill is filled, but the stroke is empty. When applying this effect, I turned this arc stroke into a path. And so it's already, I mean, it still has the handles. If you go out north, you'll see there's the scaling handles, and you still have the 2 arc handles. So in this case, I could just shorten it up a bit so it ends in empty space. That looks pretty good. But if I wanted to have it end on that line, I would go back to the square butt, and then I would actually have to leave this be for the moment, because I can't manipulate those corners individually until I've turned everything into a path. I'll leave that be. That's the power tool. If I want to use a tapering, just a tapering, I can use a similar effect called taper stroke, and it'll taper both ends. If I don't want both ends, I just want one end, I can do that. It's pretty useful as well. Applying the stroke, power stroke, to anything that isn't an open object is a bad idea. What I mean by that, this is a complete circle. If I use the power tool on this, it's just going to scale everything proportionally. I don't want that. If I were to open this up into an arc, and I scale it a little bit just so it looks better. Now this is not a complete circle. There's a hole, there's an opening. If I use the power stroke on this, you can tell the same 3 standard nodes appeared, but if I just manipulate this one, you can have something like that. So different widths. And that looks pretty good right there. The last tool I want to talk about is the offset tool. It doesn't make a lot of sense in this context, but say I wanted to create a duplicate of this sentence, or at least this word circle, I could go offset it. I'll choose a different color just so you can see what's going on. And depending on the offset, I can take that to 2, and it'll make an offset. This could be useful for outlinings, or if you want to create a sentence circle structure around some complex shapes. This could be very useful. Again, you'll see that the edges are crisp because I have a meter limit here that controls whenever they should turn sharp. Okay, I'll get rid of it right now. It doesn't really matter for me, but there we have it. Stroke styles and corners. If I for some reason had another set of lines that I needed to make up, let's say I have a line that goes from here, and that's one line right there. I'll turn the stroke black, but notice that I also have a fill color. I need to get rid of that because otherwise it's gonna mess things up. I keep saying it, but I will get to why filling is bad. Whenever you have one or the other, you always need one or the other, never both at the same time. Let's say I have a line here, and let's say I have a line here, and I want those to meet up and appear as if they were one object. Okay, now first things I need to do is I need to turn snapping on and make those what is going on? Sorry, snapping on, select the object, go to my nodes tool, make sure the nodes actually line up. So now the center of both of these align in that moment. So now they are connected at the center line. It's just the visual appearance that looks weird. So what I want to do is choose both of these, go to my endpoints, and then choose the rounded option. Because then those rounded options, those rounded corners will overlap and be concentric, so long as the lines are the same width, visually speaking. And you can tell that the rounded corners in the other end are a bit much now, so I'll just take my nodes tool and just move it back a little bit, just so I don't have that sticking out. And I'll turn snapping off, and there you go. That's how you can join up circles that don't actually belong to the same object. Okay. Now, some techniques for framing. I don't really want to go into that. It just means that you should probably choose, at least I do, I choose a shape, either a circle or something else, to act as a boundary for my text. That way I have to do some planning, I have to do some measuring, I have to play around with things until they fill up the space in a way that makes sense. Okay, I like to have a boundary so that I can end lines, or I can do whatever I need to do properly instead of just being completely unconstrained. So that's that. Now I mentioned this corner being difficult to work with because it's still a circle, it's still an arc. It says so right here. It's an arc. It's not a path yet. If I say this is my final design, I want to, turn this into one thing. It's still individual shapes everywhere. And if I drag it over all of this, it'll tell me that I have 18 objects, circles, path, and arcs. Okay. This is not the finished product. These are all still individual lines, and I can color them if I want. But you'll notice that this is a fill color, right? But this is a stroke color. So if I turn everything, if I grab everything and just turn it, say, red, it's gonna mess things up because the things that didn't have fill before got a fill, and the strokes are unaffected. That's not what we want. If we want to take this design, and I'm gonna make a duplicate just in a moment to show you what happens when you do it badly, But when you do it correctly, take the shapes, turn everything into a path. And you'll notice what happened here was this object got bigger because it had both at the same time before. And I need to do a little bit of work if I want to get that back. I can just scale it down. But that's the, I guess, danger of the path effects. Sometimes they affect the overall shape when it goes from a stroke to a path. Now, because this is a path now with 10 nodes instead of just a circle like before, I can individually manipulate each and every node. So I can take this and remove it, and now it looks good. Okay. Same goes for every other shape. Now I've turned the strokes into paths, but this is unaffected because, there was never any stroke to begin with. So I need to do the whole thing again, but this time I'm going to select object path. Now we just have 18 objects of type path. This means that everything is the same now, everything has a fill color, and I can take my union and make this whatever I want. I can take this and I can give it a gradient if I want. I could not give a gradient before because the individual objects would have tried to take on the appearance by itself, which is not what I wanted. But now we have a complete homogeneous fill we can check. So that's when it works, when you do it right. What happens if you do it badly? What happens if you mess up? Well, here I'm gonna do some visually interesting things here. I'm gonna give these, let's say you didn't pay attention when you created the dots. You didn't pay attention to remove the stroke. Okay, so if these are black, you don't notice the difference. It's just a little bigger. You don't notice that it has both at the same time. But I'm just gonna make it red so you can see what's going on. Let's say we have some objects with both fill and stroke. I try to do the exact same thing. First, we'll take everything and turn it into a stroke. Take all the strokes, turn them into a path. What happens? Well, we have 18 objects. Some of them are paths and some of them are groups. Where did the groups come from? Well, the groups came because each object with both a shape, both a fill and a stroke, they got separated but then grouped together. So this is a group. I need to ungroup that, and now I have, I have a fill and I have a stroke, and I don't need both. I just need one or the other. That's why whenever you make dots, don't give it a stroke, because now you have groups involved and you need to get rid of those groups before you can proceed to the rest of the operations. They mess things up, they stop your progress. Right, so that's that. Last thing I want to do is talk about double letters. That's probably the reason most of you clicked on this video, if you haven't clicked at all. Double letters. So let's do this. Let's make a circle. Now notice I'm gonna do 3 examples. Let's make 1, 2. Let's do that. 3 examples. Yeah. One of them is gonna be with the thick shell, and one of them is going to be a thin shell. Okay. I'm just gonna go through these in order. If I have a letter here and I want a double letter like that, it's easy, right? You can just take the innermost, take a duplicate of that. No, you don't even need a duplicate actually. You can just take this, make a cut operation, a difference operation, and then using the arc tool, give it a shape. right? There you go, you have a double letter. Easy, because it's the same width. Now, if I want to make this thicker, letter number 2, I can just make it thicker. Now you see I have the round option still turned on. I'll just turn that back to caps. And there you go. I need to do a little bit of redistribution just to make it centerline, but there we go. It's pretty easy to make thicker second letters, right? Now the opposite, if you want to make the outermost letter the second letter, you would need a complete circle. And let's say that you want to have the first one be thick and the second one thin, okay? So what happens now is you need to get rid of the inside. You can do that in 2 ways. You can either do a cut operation or you can do a difference. I'll just do a cut operation here. And I lost the letter in the progress. So I need to make a duplicate of that. Then use my cut operation, get rid of this area, and then I'm going to do the same thing as before. I'm going to make an arc and I'm going to make them line up. Now the problem most people have is they don't really perfectly line up. I'm going to turn this back into caps as well so you can see what's going on. I'm also going to turn this red so you can see even better. But the lines don't really, you can't make a good edge there, right? So what do? Well, you actually just scale it. So what happens if I'm going to use the scaling to do this, and I'm just going to line it up a little bit. Now you can tell there's still a little edge there. I can manipulate the scale a little bit more because the goal is to line up like that. Now if I turn this black again, you pretty much see no difference. You might see a tiny bit here, but that's because it's an edge. Conversely, if I were to go back in time, back before this ever got cut, to here, here we have the duplicate. If I wanted to, last time I cut the path. Let's say this time I use the difference operation. Path difference. It appears that we got the same result. I lost one of my thick rings and we cut the path. But this time, when I want to do the exact same thing, I'm going to turn this red so you can see what's going on. We have a better case for lining things up. It might look the same, but it's actually way easier this time to make that thicker corner meet with the smaller one. I just need to increase the scale of this a teeny tiny amount just until we have covered back behind. You can tell the black outline is just overlapping there. So if I turn this black now, you'll see no difference whatsoever. You just have the thick outline, yeah? And of course the other operation is just a normal arc center there. And I can tell I need to do a little bit more there. And a little bit more. There we go. So that's the opposite, okay? Notice that the difference operation was the best way to go about this, okay? If you have a thin word and you need a thick letter, the difference is the way to go. On the other hand, if you have a thick letter or thick word and you need a thin letter, let's make a Let's make it thin there. If you want to have the thin cut in, then you need to do the duplicate and then cut this part off. Remove it. You see I have the round edges again. I need to go back to the square edges. Do that. And you can probably tell where I'm going with this by now. Go to your arc nodes, make an arc. And again, if I make this another color, you can tell that it doesn't quite line up like it is. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna scale it just a bit. And the goal here is to line up again with the edges. So you're gonna do that. And same on the other side. Turn it black. And there you go. You have a thin. If I want to make a thick second letter on this, I'd just take this, I'd give it a duplicate, make it a little bigger, and then make it thicker. And there you go. So these are the three separate methods of making double letters happen on different surfaces, different thicknesses. Notice that if the border is thick and you want something thinner, then it's the cut operation that's going to be your best friend, not the other way around. Okay. And I think this is everything I wanted to show you. So I'll just stop this here. Bye.